All right, naughty, naughty StreamYard. It did this like refuse to play the video thing. All right, welcome everybody. I don't see anybody in the stream yet. So, oh, there we go. We've got David Paulman here. Wait, because the reason is first up. That was a really good post that you did over on Facebook, and I posted something myself regarding academic consensus. So I'll comment on that a little bit. So David posted something great about our, how we should be open to rejecting the scholarly consensus on certain sorts of issues, and a lot of people have quite a negative reaction to that. And I cannot stress how much I do not like that when people are hostile and really quite opposed to anybody questioning the academic consensus on an issue. There has been over the years a number of goofy conspiratorial tinfoil hat ideas that have emerged. You have people that will reject. I can't even mention some of the stuff because the video can get flagged and there'll be like notices on the video and it might get deprioritized in the algorithm or something. Not that anyone watches my videos anyway. But people being skeptical towards all sorts of things and that are like well-established facts. So, what people will do when you reject the scholarly, I can't look, I'm just starting and I can't talk. That's a problem. Let me get a drink. Maybe that'll help. Okay. So you have people that reject the consensus on a wide number of things like anthropogenic climate change or the shape of the earth or any number of other sorts of things. And what can we say about this? A lot of these skeptical views are absolutely silly. They are ridiculous. There is virtually no good evidence for them. And often those people are at the forefront of questioning academia, scholarship, the consensus on a given matter. And so what will happen is if you yourself deeply do research a particular issue and you do your homework and you come to a position that's not the consensus view on something and you go and express that, people will give you a very hard time about it and almost lump you in with people in tinfoil hats. And it's really, really frustrating. It's like they themselves cannot distinguish between an informed and serious critic and a completely insane person. What does it say about them? It's just the same sort of lazy tribalistic thing that you see in so many other places of dichotomizing and throwing people into boxes. It is intensely frustrating and ridiculous. And the ironic thing about it is that scholarship is not like it's not like agreement on a religion or agreement on like some matter of like artistic preference. The whole point of like academic scholarship is to allow and cultivate the kind of internal criticism that would allow for self-correction and progress. So for people within academia or that are defenders of academia to be hostile towards serious and well-informed critics and to just lump any criticism in with the most insane conspiratorial lunatics out there is ridiculous. It's just totally ridiculous and fundamentally at odds with what like this kind of enlightenment view of academic research is all about, which is to be receptive to criticism. And that's how progress is made. I mean, think about science itself. Science is all about internal criticism and working to develop new paradigms by falsifying and critiquing previous ones. Of course, it's not like the only thing you do in science, but when you start getting the academic world defended by a kind of dogmatic adherence to whatever the consensus happens to be, it's not a good thing. And when people just start insisting any criticism of some sort of received view, you are just a person and you're like a vaccine denier or something. It's profoundly frustrating. And it's as if there isn't frequently minority critical views among the scholars working on a particular topic. I mean, what is the threshold exactly? If 70% endorse one view and 30% endorse another view, do we tell the 30% to shut up and get in line? Like, what are the cutoffs? What are the principles? What are the standards? What are the criteria? And another thing people will do is mock people for doing their own research. Okay, so autodidacts can't contribute anything. We should just ignore them. The only thing that matters is if you have a degree. What kind of weird, ridiculous, I mean, maybe not weird, but it's just objectionably elitist. Just whether a person has a degree or not, a degree is at best a proxy or an indicator of supposed competence on a particular topic. It's not a guarantee of it. And likewise, the absence of a degree is no guarantee that you're not competent. And it's worth stressing, like many academics in the past or many researchers in the past didn't go to graduate school. They didn't have PhDs. This whole thing that everybody's got to have a PhD is a relatively recent thing. And look, I'm not saying it's not a good indicator, but people need to have the discernment to be able to sort serious people from unserious people and serious ideas from unserious ideas. That's your responsibility. And if you want to use all these superficial, or in many cases superficial, proxies of competence and seriousness, go ahead, but don't expect me to get in line and bow to that, like, you know, as if there's some sort of ecclesiastical authority over what scholarship is legitimate or not. Um, all right, so let's have a look. So David, you get 1,000. Lance Lute, Cloud of Time, good to see you. You get 500, and Anthony gets 250. All right, we got Nitty here. Hey, and by the way, David, and for anybody listening, David is Faith because of Reason. Thanks for getting a conversation going in the chat the other day. I really love a lively chat. It could be a little distracting, but it's a good kind of distraction. Let's see. David says Lance is distracting for my question on how much Lance loot. It's typically 1,000 for the first, 500 for the second, and 250 for the third. Yeah, and David here says advanced degrees are indirect evidence that you know what you're talking about. They can be easily be overridden by direct evidence that you have no clue what you're talking about. Precisely. And I've run into people that have degrees and don't know what they're talking about, and I've run into autodidacts that are brilliant. Now, that's not to say there aren't an enormous amount of people, the tinfoil hats out there with totally ludicrous and goofy ideas. And we do need good filter mechanisms for not getting those people to have their views taken. Like, look, I think that we should engage with those views and show what's wrong with them. And that doesn't mean that we need to, give everybody that has any idea a megaphone. But uh, we certainly need better criteria than degree or no degree, or whatever it is that people are doing when they talk about conforming to some sort of scholarly consensus. Surf on Earth says, Lance, this is very random, but do you have advice about writing in graduate school? Well, it's going to depend on who you're writing, like writing for what? Like writing a dissertation, writing a paper for a class, what discipline? There's going to be a number of questions there. David says he deserves bonus Lance Lute for making the chat lively. Here's what I'll do. If you make it lively again, then I'll give you Lance Lute this time. All right. All right, let's get started. I've got the video right here. We'll continue. It's like maybe 30 seconds before where we left off last time, just so it's not like just sudden and so abrupt. But we're reviewing this video on the Knight and Rose show. I think it's some kind of podcast where they brought on a Christian philosopher and apologist. Or they're a Christian philosopher. I don't know. I never know who counts as an apologist. Some people don't like that term. I don't know. Like, David, are you an apologist or not? I don't know what you consider yourself. And then Surf on Earth says, whichever you think you could give the best advice about. I'm not sure how easily I could give that kind of advice in the middle of a stream, and I don't know how much of interest it would be to other people. You're welcome to reach out to me though. So if you go over to my, like, what is it, my about page, why don't you shoot me an email, and I'm happy to talk to you about writing. I don't know if I'll have useful advice about that. So let me see. What is it? Oh, it's just my regular page. I'll throw it in the chat. This one here. Just go here. You'll find my email there. Shoot me an email. It would be difficult for me to give good advice in real time too. And it would also help if you could specify what kind of advice you're looking for. There's a number of things you could work on, which is clarity, precision, thoroughness, what kind of research to do, how to choose a topic. I'm not. This is stuff we'll have to talk like off this live. I don't know how suitable this conversation would be for that. It's kind of thing where I need to talk to you to get more of a sense of what you're looking for. Okay. Does that make sense? I want to give better advice, like just very generic and general advice without knowing more specifics may not be the best advice anyway. And I like giving advice. It's good to feel useful. Okay. So David says, I don't consider myself a pop apologist in the Frank Turek sense. Well, that's because you're not famous. Oh, burn. You got to get more famous. Wait, you have a lot more subscribers than me, right? Let me check. Not that I claim to be famous. I very much not. I'm about to hit 2,000 subscribers, and you're at 4,000. So I'm gonna beat you. I'm gonna get ahead of you. Just watch. Although I don't have 9-hour videos like you. Surfer says that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, shoot me an email, and I mean it. I'll do my best to try to reach out. I do sometimes get real busy, so you can poke me and remind me. Sometimes people reach out, and then I intend to get back to them, and then 2 months pass, and then I'm like, ugh, it'd be really awkward to email them now. So that could happen. That it sometimes happens, but yeah, uh, get in touch. We'll see what happens. And if nothing else, then you could hop on a stream at some point, and I could talk to you, and we'll figure it out. Let's get into the video. Whoop. How are we on volume? Hopefully it's okay.
As a society, and we need to be desiring further improvement morally. And I said, wait a minute, you contradicted yourself, and long silence.
Right, exactly. One of the things that people in our culture today seem to really value is this idea of tolerance. So can that idea be grounded by moral relativism?
Not really. You might think it could, because you could say, well, everything is relative, so no one can take the high moral ground. No one can rightly condemn any viewpoint as wrong or any action as wrong. So that's being tolerant. Well, for one thing, we should be intolerant of a lot of things like racism and anti-Semitism and genocide and so on. We shouldn't tolerate those kind of things. But let's talk about tolerance in a constructive sense of agreeing to disagree agreeably on important matters, not attacking the character of the other person, not physically threatening the other person. And in that sense, Christians should be tolerant because we should aim to persuade people that Christianity is true, not to bludgeon them or intimidate them or anything like that. But if you're talking about tolerance as a constructive virtue, that is to be intellectually patient and kind with people you disagree with, well, that's a claim of objective, universal, absolute.
That's so weird when they say this. That's a claim of objective, universal moral truth. No, it's not. He's just look. If you say I'm a moral relativist, moral facts depend on the standards of individuals or cultures, and then you say, also, I hold the normative moral stance that you ought to tolerate people with different standards than your own. That is a normative moral stance. It doesn't just because you express a normative moral stance, it doesn't thereby become an objective moral stance. He's just declaring that if you make a normative moral claim about tolerating other people, that it would be objective. You can't just declare that a normative moral claim is objective. Whether or not it's objective or intended to be expressed as an objective moral claim depends on the intentions of the speaker. So if I say, hey, when I make claims about whether we should tolerate other people or not, I'm making claims about what is considered morally right or wrong relative to my standards. And one of the moral standards I hold is that you should tolerate other people from other people and cultures or whatever, whatever description he gave. It doesn't even matter. Just the point is, whatever you then say is an expression of your relativist stance. Why is he just declaring that it's an objective moral stance? There seems to be a presumption here that relativists can't make first order moral claims. Relativism is a view about the truth status of first order moral claims, which holds that first order moral claims can be true. They're true relative to the standards of individuals or cultures. Like, look what he says here. Take a look.
Absolute moral truth. We ought to be tolerant. That is to be intellectually patient and kind with people you disagree with. Well, that's a claim of objective, universal, absolute moral truth.
What is he basing this on?
We ought to be tolerant of people we disagree with. But
we ought to be tolerant of people we disagree with is a normative moral claim. It's not a claim that presumes moral realism. Let's say I'm a relativist about whether food is good or bad, or tasty or not tasty. And then I say something like pineapple on pizza is tasty. It'd be very weird to say, well, if you're going to go around saying pineapple on pizza is tasty, then you are making an objective universal claim about the objective tastiness properties of pineapple on pizza. No, you're not. Like you are if that's what you're trying to say. You're not if that's not what you're trying to say. Where does he get this idea that if you're a relativist and you express a normative moral stance, it's an objective stance, so you're just contradicting yourself? There's no argument for this. It's just asserted. This is very strange. And, it's very, very common for critics of relativism to depict the view as though you can't make first order moral claims or you're somehow contradicting yourself. This is simply not true. Now, it's true that if you're a relativist, you can't, consistent with being a relativist, say it's true in a non-relative sense that you ought to tolerate other people or cultures or whatever, but that's not what the person is saying. I mean, unless you are making up a hypothetical person that is saying that, you can imagine a person that's so stupid that they're like, no moral facts are relative, or sorry, no moral facts are non-relative, and also it's true in a non-relative sense that you ought to tolerate other people morally. Like, what? Yeah, sure, someone can contradict themselves. Who in particular is contradicting themselves in that way? Has he shown that anyone in particular has contradicted themselves in that way? Nope, it's just asserted.
Tolerance really needs a moral framework and a moral foundation to.
Well, that's your position. Obviously, if by a framework and a foundation you mean an objective one, a relativist isn't going to agree with that. And so, just because you think that moral facts need to be objective for you to, in order, like, in other words, if you hold this view, in order for you to hold the first order normative moral stance that you ought to tolerate other people, you would have to ground that in some sort of foundation that's objective. Okay. But the relativist doesn't just deny that there are objective moral facts. They would also deny that you would need to ground your first order normative claims about whether or not you morally ought to tolerate other people in some sort of objective moral framework. Why would they agree to that? So just because you have a particular view, it doesn't mean that people that hold contrary views are implicitly committed to or explicitly committed to your presumptions about what the conditions necessary for moral truth are. Like, why would that be true? Like, let's say, uh, let's say you are a theist and you believe you cannot have moral truth without the existence of God. Would it make sense to say that if an atheist says that they believe in objective moral truth and that it doesn't rely on God, that they are appealing to, they're making claims about what's morally good or bad according to God? Of course not, because they'd say, no, I'm not. I'm making claims about what I think is objectively right or wrong in a way that doesn't depend on God. But if you go, yeah, but you would have to be making claims if you're a realist that depend on God, so therefore you are. Like, just because you think something doesn't mean other people are committed to thinking that way. And it seems like that's what he's doing here. It's very strange. I do have a name for this. I call it the halfway fallacy, and it's the fallacy of allowing for someone to hold a view contrary to your own, but thinking that that person must hold or must endorse or in fact does agree with some sort of more foundational or fundamental claims that you are making. So you might think something like, okay, let's say a person believes P, right? They believe the proposition P. Now, or sorry, let's go with Q because I'll pair it up with P and a Q. Let's say a person believes the proposition Q. It doesn't matter what it is. Now, you believe that the proposition Q would only be true if the proposition P were true. In other words, whatever this fact is, it depends on some other fact. Now, you say that if a person believes in Q, they must, or in fact do believe P. But that doesn't follow. A person could say, I believe Q and I don't believe P. Now, if you think to yourself, yeah, but you can't, like, Q is only true if P is true. Q's truth is dependent on P. So you got to believe P. It doesn't follow that the person, in fact, does believe P, because that person could say, I believe Q, and I don't believe that Q's truth requires P to be true. So I deny that position that you hold. And yet, sometimes when people are talking about other people's positions, they seem to think that those people can endorse a view like Q, but they could not possibly endorse Q unless they also endorse your presumed view about the relation between Q and P. That it's a very strange thing that people do where they, and like, let's say you yourself don't believe Q. So you recognize someone could believe something other than you, but then you presume that they have to believe some other thing you believe. That's not how things work. Someone could just disbelieve both of the things. Like if you believe Q depends on P and you believe not Q, okay, it does not follow that that person has to agree with P if P then Q, but they're allowed to disagree about Q. They could just deny both. And this is super duper duper routine in the way that philosophers deal with critics. Like, a skeptic will be presumed to agree, like it'll be presumed that the skeptic agrees that the realist's view about some topic or other has the intuitive view, that there's some privileged perspective on the given issue, and that the skeptic is holding some bullet biting view. And so if you reject the realist view, you're biting a bullet, you're holding an extreme or radical position. But the skeptic could just say, one, no, I reject realism about this view, and I deny there's anything counterintuitive, radical, or skeptical about, or sorry, a radical or extreme about it. So it's very, very frustrating when people presume that certain positions that they hold are correct without arguments, without evidence, and they just assert them. And I think that's happening here, and it's quite frustrating.
Obtain at all.
Mm-hmm.
Being
Right.
indifferent to everything is not tolerance. In fact, you should not be indifferent to evil. You should oppose.
It also sounds like he's mixing up his normative moral standards with whether or not it's possible to endorse tolerance on a relativistic view. I agree with his normative moral standards here. I don't think you should tolerate everybody's moral standards and cultural practices, regardless of what they are. If there's a society that practices slavery or human sacrifice, I think we should stop them if we can. Like, it might be that there could be some circumstances where we're not capable of doing so, but to the extent that we are able to prevent people from doing great evils, I don't particularly care if their culture approves of it. So I agree with him about this. I don't think you should just tolerate everybody indiscriminately. Uh, but that's irrelevant to the point that was asked, which is, whether relativists, whether it's I understood it to be something like whether it's consistent with relativism to be pro-tolerance, which it is.
Evil.
Hey, I want to raise a point. Maybe this is a bit controversial, but like we've been hearing a lot in the political realm about this idea of weaponization of government, and
I don't really want to get into the politics stuff, so let's skip ahead of this.
there are cases being Christians,
Mm-hmm.
so they
Go, I put, because it released, we had video, it takes them, but 2 + 2 = 4. Cancel culture is the being worthy of refuting. No, we're
in real life. And this is where atheists say to me, well, Christians were silent during slavery, and slavery is so on my blog in the comments.
being worthy of refuting. No, we're going to muzzle it and silence it.
Yeah. All right. Now I'm going to ask you about an objection to Christianity that I find most frequently on my blog in the comment section and even in real life. And this is where atheists say to me, well, Christians were silent during slavery, and slavery is so terrible, so I think that Christianity doesn't have any kind of corner on morality. So what would you do if somebody pushed that objection from an atheistic worldview? They said slavery is wrong, and implied that you didn't, you as a Christian had a bad record with respect to it, or you couldn't affirm that as well.
Right. Well, there's so much to say about that. I do address that in some detail in my book, Christian Apologetics. But first of all, you've got the concept of objective right and objective wrong there. So where does that come from? It's based on the idea of the unique value of human beings. And where do we get that from? Well, we get that from the Bible. You don't really find it in Islam. You don't find it in Hinduism. In fact, about a year and a half ago, Vivek Ramaswamy was trying to get the nomination for the Republican candidate for president. And he said, I'm a Hindu, and because I'm a Hindu, I believe people are made in the image and likeness of God. And I just about fell out of my chair. Hinduism is the caste system.
The caste system,
Right,
right,
sir.
Right.
So you are stealing from a worldview you do not hold. So first of all,
Yeah, I just don't think that Christians have some sort of monopoly on the idea that humans are equal. I very much doubt, if we dug into the historical record of views around the world, that like only Christians were anti-slavery or only Christians were pro-equality. You're going to find egalitarian mindsets that were not directly inspired by Christianity. And even if you didn't, okay, so let's say that Christians were like causally the originators of certain sorts of normative moral views. So what? That doesn't mean they get to claim some sort of monopoly or ownership over them, and that other people can't say, "Oh, that's a good idea," and discard the rest of Christianity and not endorse it. So, Christians try to take credit for various sorts of views, and it's not clear to me what exactly they're trying to achieve when doing this. Like what argumentative purpose this is supposed to serve, other than to try to make Christianity look good. I don't know. Oh, right. Let's have a look at the chat. There's not that much more in the chat right now. David, you're not inspiring people this time. All right. Matthias says, finally caught stream live. How you doing, Lance? Doing pretty good. We got Modern Moralist here. How are you doing? Surf and Earth says, don't some people think that that should statements are permitted if and only if they're objective moral facts? I'm not quite sure what you're asking there.
what grounds objective moral goodness? It's really the Bible. And then secondly,
how does the Bible ground objective moral goodness? And also, what does it mean to ground objective moral goodness? It's a constant talk of grounding. And I don't know what Christians mean when they talk about this. I've never seen anything in the Bible that specifically holds that moral realism is true, like that there are objective moral truths, so that the best way of construing morality is in an objective sense. I don't know why Christians promote this view. Like, where are they getting this from, that morality is objective? Like, what is this based on? Now, maybe it's based on some theological views that are that Christians endorse, but from the Bible? Is it from the Bible? If so, like where is this from in the Bible?
Want to make a distinction between the actions of the church and what the Bible actually teaches. And the Bible does not teach that slavery should be a perpetual institution based on race. It teaches nothing like that. It's a little complicated, but the Old Testament allowed for some slavery. It was much less severe than the nations around Israel. Slaves could be released. Slavery was not based on race, but it was never meant to be an order of creation, so to speak.
I'm not seeing that as much of a vindication. I mean, slavery is bad regardless of whether it's dependent on race or not. Slavery is bad and like just completely unacceptable. Like when I say bad, I don't just mean, it's kind of bad. I mean, it's abominable, disgusting, horrifying, and awful, and should have absolutely been banned and prohibited. To say, yeah, it wasn't as bad and it wasn't based on race, that doesn't in any way make it remotely acceptable. Uh, I would think that a benevolent worldview and a benevolent God would simply and unequivocally and without any ambiguity condemn slavery as an immoral abomination and call for its immediate end immediately, not 2,000 years later, immediate. That's a revolutionary view, and I've never been impressed with Christians defending the proliferation of slavery in the Old Testament and the, to me, weak response to it among early Christians. It's just not good enough. The only acceptable stance is total opposition without equivocation. That's the only acceptable stance. What Christians want to take credit for that? The view that should be the okay. Well, then it should have been in the Bible.
Is something that came about because of the fall, and then when you get to the New Testament, Paul says that trading slaves is sinful. And you've got this idea that if you can find your freedom as a slave, find your freedom. And we've got Philemon about the freed slave Onesimus and how he should be treated. So you need to make those distinctions. What makes slavery wrong? Well, it's because we're made in the image and likeness of God, and it should not be a perpetual institution. And then what does the Bible actually teach about it? Well, nothing like the Southern views of slavery, chattel slavery. And the church has been inconsistent, but Christians led the charge against slavery in the United States. And it was the Christian nations that first completely argued against and abolished slavery. It certainly was not Muslim nations or Hindu nations. So that would be my basic take on that. If you want to get into the details of how slavery worked in the Old Testament, I give some references to other sources on that in my book, Christian Apologetics. It's certainly not the case that the Bible says slavery is a great idea and Christians should own slaves. It's nothing like that whatsoever. It's really much more.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to say that for it to still have an inadequate perspective on slavery. And I know I have people here that are likely to disagree. I'm sure, like David is going to take a different perspective than me on certain biblical things, but I don't really know what David's perspective is on like biblical matters like this. I don't really discuss them often. I mostly focus on meta ethics. So this is a bit of a digression, getting into like the Bible and ethics and stuff. We've got modern moralists here that just want to say I am, as a Christian, a big fan of your work. Bad work needs to be ridiculed. Well, my wheelhouse is criticizing meta ethics, so you might be able to come up with some good objections if I start talking about not that you couldn't come up with good objections to my views of meta ethics, but I'm very much out of my element if I'm talking about the Bible and ethics and stuff like that. So it's an area where I'm pretty prone to potentially making mistakes, although I don't think I'm making one on this issue. All right. Yeah, Andrew May says, from what I've read, almost everything about grounding is pretty controversial among philosophers. Yeah, but it's not just that. It's that, they talk about grounding here, but there's no elaboration or development among Christian apologists that talk about this. Just they throw this term grounding around. Are they using a distinctive conception of grounding? Like, what are they talking about? Why don't they ever elaborate on this? They just say grounding, grounding, grounding. You don't have grounding. You don't have grounding. What the hell do they mean? What do they mean? Why don't they say what they mean? It's very frustrating. Yeah, modern moralist says, I have no clue what being made in God's image does. Can I throw out an image my child makes of me? Andrew Moy says, it doesn't follow logically for people being made in God's image that slavery is moral. You need to build a lot more into the view to get that. Maybe they do, and he's just speaking concisely, unlike, me, where I spend 3 hours reviewing 10 minutes of a video.
And when you go to the big themes of Christianity, we're made in the image and likeness of God, we're all fallen, we all need to be redeemed, and Christ came to set people free. There's obviously no room whatsoever for slavery on that theology, that worldview.
All right, let me give you a quick follow-up on that, and then Rose can ask a question. So, it seems to me that whenever you say something is wrong, you're implying that there's some kind of duty there to not do that action. And on an atheistic worldview, I'm trying to figure out how they could ground the free will necessary to make those moral decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And like you were saying before, there's
ground the free will necessary to make those decisions. What does that mean?
Don't see that there's any moral accountability. So if you get away with it, like Ted Bundy, let's figure out how they could ground. It seems to me that whenever you say something is wrong, you're implying that there's some kind of duty there to not do that action. And on an atheistic worldview, I'm trying to figure out how they could ground the free will necessary to make those moral decisions.
Yeah, it's just unclear what's meant by that. Atheism is completely consistent with both libertarian conceptions of free will, like incompatibilist views, and with compatibilist views of free will. I don't endorse any of those views, but there's no logical contradiction. So they're not going to have any trouble at all with bringing free will. They're not going to have any more trouble than Christians are, or at least not significantly more trouble than Christians are. I would think that libertarian views are quite weird, regardless of whether theism is true or not. But this isn't some sort of atheists are helpless here situation.
Mm-hmm.
And like you were saying before, I don't see that there's any moral accountability. So if you get away with it, like Ted Bundy, for a long time, there's no real problem with it. And I think incentives matter. Like if I feel like my moral actions are part of an ongoing relationship with the God of the universe, I'm going to do the right thing, whether anybody's watching or not.
Well, that's true. I'm responsive to incentives, and I think people are. So I do think that's one thing theism has going for it, which is that if you have a God that holds you accountable and there are rewards and punishments for your actions, then that's going to be a motivating factor for many people insofar as they believe that there are such rewards and punishments. So I agree with that part. That's a big advantage of theism. Surf on Earth says, I think grounding just means give the cause for X as being Y. So God grounds morality means moral facts are explained and caused by God's nature. Yeah, I mean, the issue is that someone might think that the facts in question are not caused by anything, and they might think that there are some sort of brute or primitive facts that one can't offer a further explanation for. So if you're presuming that they have to have some kind of grounding, a person might just think that they don't have a grounding of that sort, or they might just offer some secular grounding. Why presume that this is a massive problem that they can't possibly meet that's easily solved by theism? That's what I don't get. It seems to be assumed. I don't see arguments for it. It's just declared. And I see a lot of this among philosophers these days, just asserting things. You can't do this. You can't do that. You're committed to this. You must believe that. This is true. That is true. What's the arguments for these views? They just sort of pop up. Modern moralist says there are Christian free will skeptics like Peerboom is the correct view. Is Peerboom a Christian?
So what do you think about that? Like do they have a way to work around that and explain how they can make moral choices? And how do they get around that problem of moral accountability when there's nobody who can catch them?
You better not say no, they can't do it. I mean, there's just a million views out there. It's most of the contemporary academic literature is from atheist philosophers developing various conceptions of free will and moral responsibility.
Well, there is no final moral accountability on an atheist worldview because there's no God to hold us accountable, and there's no reckoning in history or in the afterlife.
Well, that might be true. Although you could have some kind of reckoning or accountability without a God. You could have some kind of karma or some other sort of supernatural force. As long as you don't know God, you could still have an atheistic worldview.
Now, the other issue is, do they have a metaphysic of human persons to allow for two things: one, moral knowledge, and two, moral agency? And the answer to both questions is no.
Just no. Okay. I'd like to know why. Like, I mean, maybe they don't, but if they don't, I don't think Christians are going to do any better on these fronts.
Because human beings are simply evolved animals, kind of glorified meat machines. So you can explain us in terms of matter, energy, space, time, and then cultural conditioning. There's nothing else left.
Yeah, this is like super reductive. I mean, one, atheists are not committed to that sort of view. They're not committed to some sort of mega reductive view that eliminates value. You're going to have naturalist realists, you're going to have non-naturalist realists, both of which are enormous number of atheists, at least among academic philosophers. So, I mean, again, he seems to be thinking of atheists as necessarily endorsing some sort of like hyper reductionist view that eliminates all these properties or phenomena that they don't have to eliminate. I mean, this is where I go with these views, uh, but I don't find anything objectionable. I think it's the right view. So, but it's still a little frustrating to see a view like an empiricist, reductive, naturalistic kind of view. It's a whole, the whole sort of camp of all the um, naturalist and empiricist and physicalist kinds of views. To see those conflated with atheism as if atheism entails those. Like if you want to go after physicalists or naturalists, go after physicalists or naturalists, not atheists. Why is the emphasis on atheism?
To appeal to, unless you're one of these atheistic moral realists, and I think that's a very untenable, unstable kind of position. So are we in a position to have moral knowledge that is justified true beliefs about the good, the true, and the beautiful?
Well, who thinks knowledge is justified true belief?
No. And secondly, given that same atheistic metaphysic of the person, you undermine a sense of moral accountability and responsibility because all you have is instinct and social conditioning. C.S. Lewis pointed this out in Abolition of Man, particularly in chapter 2. If you say, well, go by instinct. Well, which instinct? You've got a number of instincts. Some say do the courageous thing. Others say protect yourself. Some would say do this for posterity. No, just put yourself first. So you can't just appeal to instinct because instincts conflict with one another. And even the strongest instinct could be wrong. So
this is just such a crude appraisal of what atheists think or are disposed to think. Instinct? I don't even use that terminology. I don't think we just have instincts and a bunch of competing instincts. What is he talking about?
well, neither on the idea of moral knowledge nor moral agency does atheism have a way to make sense of the universe morally. And typically what atheists do is they just cheat. They steal ideas from Christianity and try to argue that their worldview actually supports these things. But sometimes they'll be extremely honest and say, well, we don't believe we're created in God's image, so we're all evolved differently, so there is no one standard to relate to all people. But that's pretty hard to swallow, and
I don't even know what that means. What? I mean, sure, humans are a product of biological evolution, and that doesn't mean I can't have moral standards or that I can't think that everybody should subscribe to the same moral standards. Yeah, sure, people are different, so what?
got Tom Holland's book, Dominion,
What is
where he's so they're tried morally. And typically what atheists do is they just cheat. They steal ideas from Christianity.
How exactly do atheists, like I am anti-slavery. I stole that from Christians. How exactly?
Try to argue that their worldview actually supports these things. But sometimes they'll be extremely honest and say, well, we don't believe we're created in God's image, so we're all evolved differently, so there is no
We're
one.
all evolved differently. I don't know what that means. Like what does he mean by evolved differently? I think people are like, is he talking about biological evolution? Because we're all like the same species. So we're not evolved that differently. I mean, sure, there are individual differences between people. What does that have to do with morality? Like, does he mean culturally? Like, there's different. Like, he's not making a distinction between biological evolution and cultural evolution. So, our cultures have led us to evolve differently, like culturally, not in biologically. What exactly is he talking about? And so, on my view, just because a culture has evolved differently from my own, or just because some individual is different from me, that has very little to do with whether I'm okay with him having a different set of moral standards than me. It's going to depend on the content of the moral standards.
One standard to relate to all people. But that's pretty hard to swallow. And you've got Tom Holland's book, Dominion, where
Mhm.
he says that all the greatest ideas of Western society, like individual rights, uh, championing the downtrodden, universal human rights, limited government, and so much great art comes from, guess what? The Bible. And
Mhm.
no other worldview supports these things. In fact, that was one of the reasons why Ayan Hirsi Ali converted within the
Right.
last 2 years. She was arguing for these sorts of values about the rights of the downtrodden, universal human rights, and so on. And she realized that as an atheist, she had no support for it whatsoever. She realized
What do you mean no support for it? Like you could just endorse these views. You don't need some worldview to be like pro equality or anti slavery or whatever it is. Like you could simply have moral standards and endorse those moral standards and want to see them realized. You don't need any distinctive worldview for that.
she realized as a former Muslim that Islam could not support this. And so she realized that all these high ideals of Western civilization had a root in the Bible. And then also
Mhm.
she had her own psychological struggles and crisis and historical philosophical reasons, and also the reason of subjectivity, that she was struggling to find meaning and purpose in life and found that in the gospel. So it's the beautiful thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Along similar lines, what are some of the problems with trying to ground morality, objective morality, in Darwinian evolution?
Well, the only resource you have if you make Darwinian evolution the reference point is that it only tells you,
Why would you ground? Hold up.
well,
Yeah. Along similar lines, what are some of the problems with trying to ground morality, objective morality, in Darwinian evolution?
Ground objective morality in Darwinian evolution. Very strange. But why would I ground morality in evolution? And here, Darwinian evolution, presumably like biological evolution, like why would I ground it in how humans evolved?
well,
Whatever that
the only
means.
resource you have if you make Darwinian evolution the reference point is that it only tells you what activities are necessary for survival, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Just a nitpick here. Natural selection operates on reproductive success, not on survival. So if you have two organisms, that are members of a species, and one successfully reproduces many times and then dies quite young, and then the other lives a very long time and never reproduces, the first of the two is going to be the one whose genes tend to get into the next generation because its genes literally got into the next generation. The survivor who didn't have offspring didn't. So survival is a means to an end. The end is reproduction. It's not survival. I don't know why people focus so much on survival.
It's not anything beyond mere survival. And Viktor Frankl said if survival is your only value, then you're essentially a nihilist. And
What? Why would that make you a nihilist? That's
we
not
know
true.
what the Nazi Party did with the idea of survival. They thought,
Oh
well,
boy. What? Is there some sort of insinuation here that if you're an atheist, you're stuck with biological evolution as their foundation for your morality, and if that's the case, then therefore Hitler, QED, atheism leads to Hitler. I mean, this is I got to be honest, this is pretty bottom of the barrel bad arguments.
the German race was the superior race,
Mm-hmm.
and they were one of the favored nations, actually, to use a term from Darwin. And so when they added that,
Guilt by association. So they used a term from Darwin. So what exactly? What's the takeaway? Should we reject evolution? Should we not be atheists? Like what?
that idea to anti-Semitism and certain ideas of blood and soil, you came up with the ideal of the Third Reich. Now, just based on Darwinian principles, no God, and evolutionary history and evolutionary forces, I don't see how you can condemn that. So if you can't,
Check out how I can condemn that. I condemn it. Look at that. Look how easy it is. You see how easy it is to condemn things? You simply can. I don't need God's approval. I don't need God to exist for me to condemn Nazis. What kind of ridiculous nonsense uh, would have to jangle around in someone's head for them to think that for you to condemn the worst things in the world requires grounding or justification? You can simply condemn things. I don't need anyone's approval. I don't need any, stance independent or objective moral facts that align with my judgments. I can simply judge. I simply can. And I've never seen a good objection to that. The objections always spin around in circles saying, oh, but then it would be arbitrary. Okay, then it's arbitrary. And I'm still doing it. So what's the issue? So there are always these efforts to try to delegitimize anti-realist perspectives, as if an anti-realist can't take a stance on moral issues. They can, and we do.
Can't condemn Nazism as objectively morally wrong.
Well, first of all, secular realists can, but things don't have to be objectively wrong for you to condemn them and for them to be wrong. The objective part is totally irrelevant. I mean, you could always flip this. If for whatever reason, maybe you think it's not possible or whatever, if for whatever reason, something that we would all agree, we could all agree that something is horrific and awful and repugnant, and it could turn out in principle that it's objectively good. Well, then I would be against morality. And I would hope that the people in this podcast would be against morality if morality mandated that we torture babies or do something horrific or awful. I act based on my values and my perspective on what's morally right or wrong. I don't care what the objective moral truths are. Why do realists care?
Wrong with your worldview. Now, people might say, well,
yeah, Patterns. Did he say no true condemnation? Did he actually say that?
Is a term from Darwin. And so when they added that idea to anti-Semitism and certain ideas of blood and soil, you came up with the ideal of the Third Reich. Now, just based on Darwinian principles, no God and evolutionary history, I don't see how you can condemn that. So if you can't condemn Nazism as objectively morally wrong, then there's something very wrong with your worldview. Now, people might say, well, through evolutionary changes, we found what kinds of mores are conducive for a freer, better society and which aren't. Say, wait a minute, you begged the question there. You're assuming certain views of society. Sam Harris does this in his book, The Moral Landscape. And he debated Bill Craig, and the debate was like over in the first 10 minutes because Bill basically said, Sam, you're cheating. You're saying you like free societies, you like representative government, so let's just use science and politics to bring that about. Well, how do you justify those as objective moral values on your naturalistic worldview when there's nothing but the universe and nothing outside the universe?
That's a great point.
Exactly. Does atheism offer a rational basis?
Yeah. So, I mean, picking on Sam Harris is again going for a bottom of the barrel. Like Sam Harris has a completely confused and underdeveloped view on metaethics. He doesn't really know what he's talking about on the topic. Pretty easy to pick on him. I would love to see what they have to say about why. Look, not that I'm defending the views that they have, but there's a meat on these bones, at least some meat. It's meat I'm very critical of. But you've got Mike Humer, you've got David Enoch, you've got Terence Cuneo. Some of them are Cuneo, I think, is a Christian, but still can defend moral realism without having to appeal directly to Christianity. So you have a number of secular moral realists. I'd like to see what they would say is wrong with those views. It frustrates me when they, or for that matter, because there's going to be realists that are secular realists that are they're going to object to a lot of what's being said here. How would they object to anti-realists that are not, because Harris is an example of a moral realist, but not one that has a particularly well-developed position. Well, I mentioned a bunch of non-naturalists. Okay, so you got three types of views I'd like to see them go up against. You've got naturalist realists, just not Sam Harris. You got like Railton and Boyd and other naturalist realists. There's that Strelny and Fraser paper that's pretty cool. Then you've got the non-naturalists. I'd love to see what they have to say about why they're wrong. And then you've got anti-realists. And if you're going to go up against anti-realists, I'd like them to go up against stronger anti-realists than, I don't know who they're talking, like random undescribed people. Like, we're not seeing some sort of engagement with like Richard Joyce or something like that, which is what I would like to see.
Basis for choosing the moral action when it goes against
worldview, and there's nothing but the universe and nothing outside the universe.
That's a great point.
Exactly. Does atheism offer a rational basis for choosing the moral action when it goes against self-interest? When nobody may find out. We hear from atheists quite a bit. Well, I'm good. I choose to do what's right. One of the things we talk about among ourselves sometimes is, what about when no one's watching, you won't be caught, and it does in fact go against your own self-interest? Is there any rational basis for choosing what is moral?
Well, oh gosh, I hope the answer to this isn't no. It's not irrational to act in a way that doesn't promote self-interest. Like if we're characterizing self-interest as acting in a way that like directly promotes what's good for you personally, independent of like okay. So this term is a little murky. So let's say I value my friends and my family, or I value society as a whole. If I act so as to bring about something good for my family or society as a whole, because that's what I value, am I acting out of self-interest? So if by self-interest you are confining this to acting to like promote my personal wealth or my personal success or things for me directly, rather than it being anything that is representative of my values, even if those values have to do with the welfare of others, if you're confining it to the former, how would it be irrational to act in the interests of your friends or your family or society as a whole if that's what you wanted? Uh, so, if you have an instrumentalist view of rationality, then acting rationally would be acting with respect like to efficiently achieving your goals and interests. And your goals and interests as an atheist could simply be non-selfish. You could be concerned about the welfare of others. So, there's nothing unless you have some kind of realist conception of rationality, and then you think like if there are no objective moral truths, that you're only the only rational thing to do is to act in self-interest. Like you would need quite an argument for that. And so I really, really, really hope he doesn't say no. It'd be irrational for atheists to act altruistically or in the interest of others, or at least not act in a self-interested way. So this is going to turn a lot on what you mean by rational, what you mean by self-interest. And unfortunately, at this point, I very much doubt we're going to get any development on what's meant by those terms and, really a satisfactory way of engaging with them.
Well, I don't think so because you don't
I don't
have
think
the
so.
worldview.
Oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. Okay, so I care about my wife. So if I'm acting to help my wife and my family, I'm being irrational as an atheist. What the hell does that mean? Why would I have to act only towards my own interests in order to be acting rationally? And okay, let's say then I'm acting irrationally. So what? Who cares about that conception of rationality? I don't endorse it. I wouldn't endorse a conception of rationality that holds that because there's no objective moral truth. Therefore, the only rational thing to do is act in self-interest. What? Why? So is there some sort of like lexical priority where the rational thing to do, if there are objective moral truths, is to comply with those, whatever they happen to be, and to suppress one's self-interest, but in their absence, the rational thing to do is to act in self-interest. So does that mean in every neutral case, like let's say there's an instance in which I could do something that promotes my interests, or I could do something that promotes someone else's interests, but there's no moral obligation for me to do the latter, that it would be irrational for me to favor myself? Sorry, it would be irrational for me to not favor myself. Why? So if I just wanted to be kind to someone else, is that irrational if there's no objective moral truth? If so, why? What if I want to be kind and I would feel bad if I wasn't kind? Well, then you might say, well, the motivation. Yeah, I guess in that case, you could say the motivation could be that I would feel bad, but that doesn't have to be the reason why you did it. This is a common problem when people argue for something like psychological egoism. Is if you give them some action, like a person like jumping on a grenade to protect other people, they'll say, well, they just did it for glory, or so that they'd always be remembered. You can always come up with some sort of explanation about what someone did could be done out of self-interest, but that's a very different thing from showing that it was in fact done out of self-interest. So you have that. I don't buy the psychological egoism, but the notion that you have some sort of in the absence of objective moral truths, a rational obligation to act out of self-interest is very bizarre. That itself sounds like some kind of normative realist notion of rationality that an anti-realist is very likely to reject. And of course, if you're an atheist, you don't have to be an anti-realist in the first place about any type of normativity.
Worldview resources.
So there's just like an onion of problems here. So atheists aren't obliged to not be realists. Even if they were, they're not obliged to endorse this conception of rationality. Even if they, so they don't have to. Fucking freezing in StreamYard. StreamYard, fix this stuff. It's you. It's not any other service. If I go in Riverside or some of these other services, they don't freeze. It's just you, StreamYard. Okay. Anyway, so to get back to it keeps freezing. It's pisses me off, breaks my flow. So you have an onion of problems here. One, atheists are not obliged to be moral anti-realists. They could just be realists. Second, even if they were moral anti-realists, they could still be realists about rationality and have some different perspective on what they're rationally obligated to do in the absence of there being objective moral truth. Third, they could just deny this particular conception of rationality and hold some contrary position on rationality. They could hold an instrumentalist view. What was that? The third one. The fourth point would be, let's say they just grant that they're not being rational if they don't act in self-interest. So what? It's that whole folk label thing that David Lewis talks about. So, what are you going to do? Slap a label on them? And that's supposed to be something that is going to concern them? Why should it concern them?
To draw from. If you're a Christian and you could supposedly get away with something immoral, that God is your witness and you know what the moral standard is. So you choose to, as Jesus said, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow him. And that's the right way. That's the best way. But for the atheist, it really just comes down to personal choice. And probably the exemplar there would be Jean-Paul Sartre from his book, Existentialism and Human Emotions. He says there is no God, there's no human nature because there's no God to bring it about. And there's no heaven of ideas, meaning there's no objective moral values, no standard. So human action boils down to just creating values as you go along.
Yeah, but the values you create don't have to be self-interested values. You could be altruistic and kind or not. And yeah, that view he described sounds great. That's what you should do. Create your own values.
That's all there is to it. He tries to rescue morality in various ways about
there's nothing to rescue here. Create your own values.
Having bad faith, not blaming things on others, and choosing for the whole human race, which I think is just a smokescreen. I don't even know what the heck he meant by that. But if there's no God and we're not moral creatures made in God's image, then pretty much it comes down to arbitrary personal choice. And the atheists, as I said earlier, are often stealing. They're cheating. They're taking ideas from Christian.
Yeah. So for me, my moral standards, yep, arbitrary, totally arbitrary. I deny I'm stealing anything. What am I stealing? It doesn't matter if values are arbitrary. So what? Who cares? I don't care. What is the objection exactly? Like what? It's just very frustrating to deal with this sort of thing where there's like all these implied objections, but they're not really laid out.
And applying them to a worldview where their ideas don't belong. So I say, well, go back and read Friedrich Nietzsche, The Madman. What's left of the universe and society and the person when God is removed? Nothing is the same. Everything has radically changed. The earth is hurtling through space, unchained from its sun. There's no up or down left. Or to get a little more obscure and nerdy, read Max Stirner, the great.
Yeah, but Nietzsche's view is very positive and life affirming. Yeah, so if your confidence in God is undermined, you may be in a state of discombobulation, but there's light on the other side of that tunnel. When you abandon the Christian moral paradigm that has held so much of the Western world in its grip for so long, you can become free to develop your own values and be your own person and pursue your own goals and interests. Yeah. That's not, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing.
Great German atheist nihilist who said absolutely nothing is forbidden if there's no God. All that matters is your ego.
Yeah, nothing. Look, if moral realism is false, then nothing stands independently wrong. Absolutely nothing in particular follows from that. It does not follow from that genocides are acceptable or good. It does not follow from that baby torture is acceptable or good. What that does is it puts the onus on you to act on your own values. Now, in practice, I think this is what realists already do. But, it's not like, and really putting the onus on you, you don't have to do anything in particular. You could just not have moral standards. You could have a very rigid set of moral standards. There's nothing in particular, practically speaking, that follows from anti-realism being true. Nothing in particular at all. You could go on acting on, you could be a Christian anti-realist and act on exactly the same moral standards as you acted on before you became an anti-realist. It just doesn't have any direct practical entailments. It just doesn't. You could just do anything. And this is supposed to be depicted as some sort of dreadful, horrific, awful thing. I don't think there's anything dreadful, awful, or horrific about it. And I haven't seen any good arguments that there is.
And his book was called The Ego and Its Own. I talk about that actually in Christian Apologetics. He makes Nietzsche almost look wimpy. He's so insistent in his nihilism.
Yeah,
Nietzsche tried to overcome the nihilism in various ways. Of course, he couldn't do it.
Of course he couldn't do it. Yeah, I think he succeeded. So Mason Colbert says, again, Nietzsche embraced active nihilism. He argued we needed to develop new values in the secular age. For him, nihilism was liberating. He criticizes passive nihilism, which is doom and gloom. Yep. So how exactly did Nietzsche fail? Are we going to get arguments for how he failed or why he failed? It doesn't sound like it. This is really disappointing. It's just he's making a lot of claims here, but he's not backing up those claims. He's mentioned his writings. Maybe he backs them up in his writing. But I would be so uncomfortable making claims and not thinking it important to stop to address them and back them up.
Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot. Like today, it seems like there's a lot of support for follow your heart, and everybody seems to be, even when you're doing prudential judgments, like, I don't think it's a good idea for you to take out $100,000 of student loans for a degree in English. If you're thinking that you're going to start a family and have 4 kids, you may struggle to find work unless you're the best, in which case you could do anything you want. But I remember working with a coworker of mine who was raised Christian named Will, and he dropped his faith the minute he hit college. And he was very successful as a software engineer. And I tried to ask him on what basis he was justifying adopting the moral point of view, donating money, and all the good things that he was doing. And he said, well, doing the right thing makes you feel good, and it makes people like you. And I'm just thinking, I'm not so sure if it's always like that. And I think that's where people are at. They're not seeing things the way that you described it. They're seeing it more like this is an aid to survival, is to comply with the society that's around me. Do you have any thoughts on that before I go on to the next question?
Well, sure, you could say that altruism has certain personal benefits, but I don't even think that's a moral statement. I think that's just trying to survive and thrive and get along in life. Morality really has to do with doing the proper action for the right reason. It's far more than just engaging in actions that seem generous or which end up being for your good.
Yeah.
Morality is really having the right view and putting it into effect, come what may, though the heavens may fall, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
And as the culture changes and has changed drastically since your friend was in college, if he's still doing what makes him popular, what makes people like him, what makes him feel good, he's probably living his life in a completely different manner, wouldn't you think, than he would have 20 years ago?
Yeah, definitely. I think things have definitely. So you would be at the mercy of that if your standard was, what do the people at work think of me? How do I get ahead? People in Stalin's Soviet Union,
not really,
and Cambodia and these other communist countries. F.A. Hayek talks about that. So yeah, he when you're living on the fumes of kind of declining Christian civilization, then it's easy to say doing the right thing is giving money away. But my next 2 questions with someone who doesn't. Although I think what you've said already was really fantastic to get people to think, just trying to challenge them to say, are you going to go through life with this kind of with someone who doesn't have this solid in their mind? But here's my question. So I've noticed today that many people are uncomfortable with the idea of judging. The most popular Bible verse among non-Christians seems to be don't judge, and that's all. They don't quote the rest. In the context of romantic relationships, how does the ability to be moral affect the quality and stability of the relationship?
Okay, I'm not really interested in that. So let's see if there's any more meta ethics here.
And you can get stronger in doing that. But I've been saying this for many, many years, even before the whole LGBTQ explosion, boundaries.
Good-looking guy, and he was saying the same thing that him.
Love God, say no to yourself.
Is there any recent work you've done that you'd like to tell people about?
Because sexuality is not the only thing in life, the most important thing in life. And when it becomes that, it obviously becomes an idol, and it ends up debasing everyone.
Well, tell us where people can find your writings. We know that you...
Okay. Yeah, you could check the video out for that. So that's it for that video. I'm going to wrap it up there. I may review another video in a little bit. I may go take a break. I don't know if I'll be back, but check, and then I'll continue with reviewing something else. Why don't I stop though before I head out? So we're done with this video. Are there questions for me in the chat? Anything you want to talk about? Anything to address? I don't know if is David still here? I haven't seen him in the chat much. I don't think he is. Yeah. Anything else you all want to ask me before I head out? We'll start another stream in a bit if I'm up for it, and keep going from there. No? Okay. We will wrap it up there. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. I hope that was helpful for you. Wrapping up another video on meta ethics. There's just so many of them to do. I don't seem to be getting tired of this stuff, and I hope you aren't either. All right, so we'll do the same as I always say. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already, leave a comment in the comment section. Oh, and you are welcome, and I saw that some people did, is to go over and have a look at the original video itself. Feel free to leave a comment. If you do, please be kind, be respectful. Let's cultivate a community on YouTube of people that are not jerks in the comments. There's no reason to be condescending or obnoxious or smarmy or rude, or just don't be a jerk. So if you go over there, be respectful. If you want to engage with and comment on, maybe you like the video and you want to praise what they did. Maybe it seems unlikely for people that are watching me critique stuff, but you never know. Maybe people are like hate watching or disagreeing with me in the chat, or like at least viewers, even if you're not chatting. Or maybe you agree with me and you want to contend with them on some of the claims made in the video. That'd be great. Either way, if you do engage over there, be respectful. All right. Thanks, Cloud of Time. Yeah, Cloud of Time says so much to talk about, but chat limitations disincline me to say much. Thanks for the stream. You got it. All right, everybody. So do all the stuff. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that. Take it easy.